Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/vmspod or paypal.me/vmspod to make a one-time or recurring donation and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. Well, for those of you who were worried after last week's show, my conference went great. I did manage to find transportation for 50 people who needed to get from the hotel where we're throwing the conference 5 miles away to the restaurant where we're having our networking dinner. And otherwise, yeah, everything was good. Attendees were happy. Nothing major went wrong, although some people showed up really late right before their presentations were about to start. Everybody got me their slides. Projectors didn't break down. The meals all showed up. Coffee was good. So yeah, that's all over in the past. I'm sort of still recovering from it in some respects. It's the perils of being a one-man show. The upside is when anything goes wrong, I'm the only person to blame. I guess that's not really an upside, but that is the micromanaging control freak you have come to know and ignore over the past couple of years. The one thing that sucked about the show was the day before it began. That was Monday of last week, and the news about Harold Bloom's death came out that afternoon, and that saddened me a lot. Not that Bloom and I were friends or anything, but we recorded an episode together. I stayed in touch just a little bit, not wanting to abuse, his email. But the loss just really struck me that day, along with the holy crap, I'm burned out, stressed. What the hell am I doing with my life? I should be doing something literary, ha. But that was something. I'm just afraid we're not going to see the likes of that sort of writer or reader as Bloom again, regardless of what you think of the writing. The sense of a life devoted to books. I don't know. It just was really jarring to me and a tough start to the week. But I wrote to his wife, wrote to a few of our mutual pals, just sending condolences. One of them sent condolences back, knowing that he wasn't the only person who lost Bloom and what he meant. Anyway, sorry to start in a downer, but that gets us to this week's show, which is all about memory. Our guest this week is the cartoonist Frank Santoro. He's got a brand new book out from New York Review Comics titled Pittsburgh. It is one of the more beautiful and subtle things I've read this year. It's a 200-page comic. It's about Frank's parents' marriage and divorce and the neighborhood in Pittsburgh where most of that rise and fall took place. It's not a book I was expecting. I know Frank. I know he's a good artist, but I wasn't expecting a work this good out of the blue like this. Frank drew Pittsburgh. The whole thing is drawn in colored markers, and the pages all show their paste ups and inserts, and you get a sense of the physical page each one was scanned from for the book, and it gives the whole thing a sense of being constructed. And I don't mean it in a bad way, because that technique lends itself to Frank's work evoking the landscape and the architecture and the sense of being in a lived-in space, one that belongs to just this person and the memories that he's built over the years with his family. And you might not get that with a slick production style. I mean, the whole thing is a work of memory, like I said, of stories that are getting told and reinterpreted about family and friends. And his visuals capture that sense of what we focus on and what we let slide, and how we try to reconstruct those places and events that we didn't know would matter so much. It's weird, but it's sort of like being inside someone else's memory palace, one of those mental constructions where every physical thing is an analog for memory, or for a memory. And I try and get that across to Frank in my comment to him about how I regretted it when I was closing in on finishing the book, because it's a sense of leaving that space. And it's a space that isn't space and isn't time, but it's something in between. Pittsburgh, like I say, it's beautiful and subtle. Frank's writing is very spare and poetic at times. And we talk a bunch about the musical and poetry derived aspects of the book, or how what he does in comics reflects some of those other forms. As an artist, he's really conscious of page layout and design, but none of it feels forced in this. There's a very much a strong sense of it being organic and loose. And again, we get into all this stuff in the conversation. All I can say is Pittsburgh is a wonderful and haunting book, and I hope it finds a wide audience, because a book this good really deserves to be read. It's from, like I say, New York Review Comics. Now, as caveats go, not a lot. We recorded at Cartoon Crossroads, Columbus, in my hotel room. I had a head cold going, but I didn't have to talk too much. Now, here's Frank's bio. Frank Santoro's work has been exhibited at the American Academy of Arts and Letters in New York City and at the National Archaeological Museum of Naples, Italy. He is the author of Storyville and Pompeii, and has collaborated with Ben Jones, Dash Shaw, Gary Panter, and others. He lives in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and his new book is Pittsburgh. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Frank Santoro. What I'm curious about initially is the assembled quality of the visuals, and both the process and the thought process going into that, and how it sort of mimics memory and the construction of memory throughout the thing. But I'm putting words in your mouth. Tell me about like the sort of physical making.
Yeah, the physical making. I thought that I would maybe just shoot the images on a copy stand, like like paintings or drawings or something, and then I tried that, and the colors didn't look as great, and so I scanned everything. I mean, I scanned, I could scan one side of each spread at a time, and I compose and the left and right together. And the left and right together is taped together, and sometimes you can see that division. And so I just wanted it to look exactly like it was on the board, and so I wasn't interested in overdubbing, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And then the assemblage of, for me, it's always about like the first or the second take of the drawing, and I just wanted to stay true to that. And so if I'm trying to remember what a family member looked like or what a room looked like, I just wanted to have that first initial take with feeling, and I would just sort of tape things down or use tracing paper or something to make it feel closer to what I saw, and that's how I would edit also. But it's interesting with the memory stuff, because I don't necessarily I didn't do that so consciously. It was kind of intuitively. Sure. And but it works, and so I think I'm happy that there's this correlation between memory and so there's something that I think about a lot, which is like mapping and like mapping in memory, and like the earliest memories that we have are maps of the rooms that we're in, the spaces that we inhabit, and how that is some of our deepest memories. And so I didn't have photographs of a lot of the things that I was trying to draw, and I just wanted to sit with those memories, and I was really interested in the feeling that I got when I was making those drawings, and if I could like conjure those feelings, and these things would come up, like new images would come up, new feelings would come up, new memories would come up, and that was really exciting. And so I just tried to stay in the scene, is what I would tell myself, and not push the narrative, not have an and then. And so the assemblage or something even went so far as like the spreads themselves, so I could shuffle the spreads, I could shuffle the scenes.
Yeah, I was wondering, how linear was it?
Yeah, not at all. Yeah. So it's just like I knew I wanted to do the scene with my dad on the porch. I knew I wanted to do the scene with my godfather in his house. I knew I wanted to do the scene with my mom in a car. And so then I would just sort of, and then I could feel it or I could see it. But again, like memory, like when one tells a story, one often tells the story out of order. Like, my mom always wants to tell stories like in order. She starts like at the very beginning, and then I always get to the point, get to the punchline. And so I just, I was conscious of that, just trying to like tell my story without too much setup, and also just trying to put the reader into the moments. But I was also interested in kind of just like cutting back and forth in the way that memory works. And so one's memory rhymes with just these like little moments in time, and time just folds in on itself in this kind of remarkable way. And I think comics is a wonderful illustration of that, and is able to capture that in a way that's not with like film or words on paper simply, or something like that.
I mean, it also feels like an environment, and not simply Pittsburgh, but the neighborhoods, the homes, etc. It was this weird sense I had getting near the end that I was disappointed that I was going to be leaving this visual and spatial world, not simply the story and the memories within it. It's a remarkable achievement in that respect, because I rarely get that sort of vibe, but that sense that it's a world that you're stepping into, that you managed to evoke with this visual style and the way it's composed throughout the.
Thank you. Yeah, book. I mean, Pittsburgh is a very different place than everywhere else in the country, if not the world. I mean, it's a very unique environment because of the hills and the rivers, and it was built really before the car. It was the richest city in the world in 1895 and things like that. And so, like I had that imprinted on my memory when I was young, and then when I went to California, like it was just so different. And so just drawing, landscapes or something, like I also had teachers that really, encouraged me to draw contour line drawings of just the backyard or, Pittsburgh itself. And so some of my earliest comics, I would just inject these backgrounds that I could just do first take contour line drawing, and it looked better than some, made up. Because a lot of backgrounds in comics, there's a kind of like you learn perspective and you just stick to that particular perspective, and a lot of that stuff in like how to draw comics books and any how to draw book is like there's this strange forced perspective that is a very unnatural perspective. It's actually wrong, and so if you can eyeball that stuff and just be able to draw it loosely, and there were some artists, for example, like Kyle Baker did these great backgrounds in his comics that were just really loose, and I was a huge Ben Catcher fan, and so that just jibed with my teachers in middle school, just getting me to draw what was around me. And so just drawing what was around me and feeling comfortable just making sketches of rooms and views out the window, for example, and there's a great tradition of that in art. And so I always felt comfortable just injecting that into my narrative, and then that just felt like it worked well with, just the environments I was trying to create. So like I always wanted to make the reader feel like they were really in that space, and like a movie, how it's blocked, and you really can feel. It's not like a stage play, it's not flat, and you can bring the reader into the space. You can move them around, and I've always done that in my work. But then with this book in particular, that's just really what I wanted to draw. Like I really just wanted to draw houses and streets and alleys, and the way Pittsburgh really looks and feels, and the color, and the color especially, and because the color is Fauvist, or impressionistic, but more like expressionist, and more like early Matisse or something. And so I just wanted to kind of pull in that 20th century idea of art and improvisational painting. Like in painting, you can paint out things and then fix it and change it, but with black ink on a board, there's only so many changes you can make before like there's too much buildup, and you can't really make the lines in the same way. So in this book, there's no black lines. It's all color. The black lines are only the words, and I just wanted that environment, that world, to feel kind of like gauzy, colorful memory, golden hour type of things, dawny, downy, gauzy. It's a warm blanket to wrap yourself around.
How much did your painting background influence this comic in particular, but also the work in general?
Yeah,
how do you find
that
interplay?
A lot. However, I love painted comics, but there's a schism for me with painted comics where there's always the words are not on the page.
They're laid on top of.
They're laid on top,
yeah.
and especially now with the fonts and everything. So even the earliest painted comics, like Moonshadow by John J. Muth, or the Blood comic by Kent Williams, or David Mack's comics in the 90s. Like there's this. It's different than Jean-Michel Basquiat, where he's drawing in color and using color, oil sticks or something, to make words, and so there's a unity with that. And I always think about Ben Catcher said something in the 90s where his work was half-toned for the newspapers that it was being carried in, and the words were extremely pixelated. And I believe it was Chris Ware who said to him that you could, in Photoshop, drop in the words, and the words didn't need to be half-toned, and you could make it like that. And I think Ben's response was, but the words wouldn't then be part of the art. They wouldn't be part of the narrative. They wouldn't be on the same board. And so the layering thing that I'm trying to do, I'm using the overlay like other painted comics for sure, but it's my hand, because it's the only black on the page. I just wanted to try to integrate it a little more, and I am using word balloons, but I'm using like translucent or transparent word balloons. I'm letting the color show through. So a lot of with painted comics, there's like these white word balloons that just kind of like break up the color space. So I always enjoyed painted comics, and I thought that my painting background has always informed my drawing, but there's always a frustration there where making, I call it black line comics. Like, so it's just like it's like a black line, and then the color is an afterthought. Whereas in painting, the color is immediate. It's directly when you start. You don't start with a black line and then fill in, or you don't like do color and then draw a black line around it. It's different. And so like Matodi, Kiki Picasso in France, there's a lot of examples of great color work in the last 30 or 40 years. But I also have found that painted, when you scan painted boards, the scanner or the stat camera, it reflects the pigment in the paint, and it changes the color of the paint. And so markers actually scan better. There's a more true color there. And then I'm drawing with the color. I'm not just filling in with a brush, or like, there's a lot of comics, James Kolchaka has done comics where he draws it in blackline and then he can, in Photoshop, change the color. A lot of people have done that, or use color pencils and use different color pencils. But I kind of wanted, like, the markers, there's an immediacy to markers, and I think markers has a very specific look, and it's a look that's only existed, like the last 30 years. So instead of making pastel comics or making, oil painted comics, watercolor comics, like these things that kind of have a more traditional thing, I wanted to make a more modern 70s thing.
I was going to say that there's a specific 70s.
Yeah.
It's also partly about your childhood, although you're represented as an adult in it too, but it captures
like
the childhood.
Orange carpets and like very strange color schemes.
There are some of the upholstery, the patterns you have on the sofas and things. I'm like, we the wagon wheel table and all that. That's all.
Yeah. So that was very conscious. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What did you have to learn to make this book? And did you have to mature artistically or emotionally more to be able to?
That's a great question. I think patience. I'm kind of an impatient person, and so like slowing down in the drawing, slowing down in the presentation, slowing down and listening to myself, not pushing the narrative, like I said earlier, but I had to kind of learn. Also had to like give voice to characters that weren't, it's not fiction, so I can't just, kind of like,
give them a perspective, or give them
just kind of invent something for them. Like I really wanted it to be that person, and I really tried to learn how to stay true to those voices that I heard. That was really my mom speaking, or my dad speaking, or another relative or somebody. And I just had to learn how to like stay wide in the narrative too, like not get so bogged down in details. I mean, the details make the story, but when I was really trying to tell my parents' story, and I was trying to learn how to, part of this book is like learning to accept them as people also, and not just my parents. And that was something I feel like I learned 20 or 30 years ago when they did divorce, but making this book was like trying not to judge them, trying not to put too many of my like not my feelings on the page, but like my resentments or my anger.
I was going to point out, it's not Frank centric.
Yeah,
book.
I didn't want it to be.
It seems a very conscious thing to not make it your whining.
Thank you. Yeah. Because I think autobiographical comics get a bad rap, and I didn't necessarily even think I was ever making an autobiographical comic, because I started out really just to tell the story of my parents, and I sort of a lot of like the gathering the material for the book and talking to my family about the book was a way of trying to get, be close to them and ask them, like, what did they really think? What happened? What was it like when you were in high school and during the Vietnam era? Like, what was it like when, you eloped to Maryland at 17? Like what was all that like? And maybe all that didn't make it into the book, but it gave me an idea of who these people were as people, and not just, family that I either took for granted or resented or loved in my way. But it's everybody has parents, whether we know them or not, whether we have them or not. And so I think everyone's interested in their origin story, and so how you inject yourself into that story. Like, if your parents don't get together, like, you don't exist. And so I didn't want it to be about me as much as about them, but their story is, of course, my story. And I learned all that through this process. Like, it was like a collage of memory that I thought that I would just make it for me, and maybe it would be unreadable and not accessible. And if it was something that, like a painting, like a person can come to that painting with their own feelings about it and then get something from that painting, just a view out of a window or something like that, and it gives them feelings or makes them think something, I don't know, like art, that's what's magical about art, and poetry and music and hearing melody and what that does to one's, thoughts about the world, or something. I mean, I didn't think about that so consciously, but just like I didn't want to be
me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I will point out one phenomenon. Men tend not to know how their parents met and got together. Women do. Just from my unscientific attempts at this, because I had a pal who lives in Spokane, Washington, is half black, half Japanese, which you would think at some point his parents' meeting would have actually, because it's the whitest place in the world, Spokane. He had no idea. No idea how his parents met. I'm like, really? That's interesting. So I started asking around. Women tend to know the details. Men don't. At what point did you know some of your parents' history in that respect? Was it a long-standing thing, or was it something you came to? You mentioned like learning a lot of stuff at your 30s.
There was stuff later. Yeah. There were, there was lots of hidden details, but I was lucky in so much as that I lived with my father's parents lived in the first floor. It was when my father's parents got married and moved out of my grandfather's mother's house and got their own house, they rented the top floor apartment, to make money. And then when my parents got together, we moved in with, when I was born, that's part of the story, like we lived with my father's parents. And so, whether it was old photos or old stories or we were it's like an older way of being a family. Like, you're all sort of in one house. And so I saw some of the photos, my mom in high school or my dad as a Marine or something like that. And I knew some of the story, and I think because I asked them about, how they were married or something, and I would hear that they eloped, but they didn't get the whole story. But I would, there's photos of them in high school and stuff like that. And so I knew a little bit of it like that. And then I heard stories because my dad's friends and my mom's friends were, largely just high school friends back then. And, but then the hard details, what really happened in Vietnam, or what really happened between my mom and her family, and why she was living with my father's parents, I didn't fully understand that stuff until later, for sure. But I really got interested in it because they divorced when I was 19, and I don't have any brothers and sisters, and I just didn't have anybody to talk to about it, and the family just split right down the middle. There's some communication between both sides, but it was just sort of me piecing together the story, and from afar too, like in California. And I never made really autobiographical work or anything. It would just be like coming home and getting a new detail about my dad's experience in Vietnam, or about my mom's experience with her family, and it would change all through the 90s. I'd have this different perspective, every summer that I came home, or every Christmas, or it wasn't every year that I went home, or every Christmas I went home, of course, but that would just change. And when it changed, I just kind of thought what really did happen, and then I don't know, I think when my parents really started getting older, and I started talking to them after I made my first book. I wanted to do a kind of a Pittsburgh history book. I thought I could do just a kind of a generic history of Pittsburgh or something like that. So I interviewed a lot of my family, about Pittsburgh, but through telling me about Pittsburgh, they got to tell me about their lives. And so in the late 90s, my grandparents started to pass away, one after the other, until about 2001 or so. And so I think just to get close to them when they were older, and kind of driving them around to doctor's appointments and stuff, I'd be like, well, tell me that story about my dad when, he got back from Vietnam, or tell me that story about my mom when, she had a fight with Uncle Joey or something like that. And so things like that just happened. And that was, like I said, like the process of learning how to accept my whole family as people and not just like as my family or something.
At what point did you know this was going to become a book?
It was really strange how it all came about, because it was, my dad came to a book signing. There was a Kramer's Ergo tour in 2007, and Sammy Harcum came to Pittsburgh and met my dad outside of the venue for the event. And the hospital that my dad worked at was across the street, and he just told Sammy his whole war story to like a stranger. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know this story until I was like 30 years old. And Sammy, I didn't know this, but then he did a 1-page comic strip about it, showed it to me before he printed it in Crickets 3, his comic book. And I was really struck by it. And so I made a response comic, 1-pager, that was just me being, struck by how my father could tell this story to a stranger like he was telling the time or something, like the stranger asked him what time it was, and he told him his whole life story. And I was like writing a column for, one of my blogs, or, I don't know. And I just did another, like the first 2 pages of the book were just something that I did as a kind of, and not another response to it, but I just thought like, all right, well, maybe I should try to tell this story. Like how, this is such a great story. My mom's in high school, my dad's in Vietnam, and it was like just these 2 pages, because there was this great story about my mom being homecoming queen and sending 3 heavy envelopes to my dad of photos, and then the sergeant that was giving out the mail was so mad that my father got 3 big letters. He flinged them at my father in the sharp corner of one of the envelopes, nailed him square right between the eyes. And I just thought this is a great metaphor for their relationship. And I just did those 2 pages, and Dan Nadal, my publisher at Picture Box, said that he really liked those. Like, wow, those are great. You should do more of those. And Picture Box still existed at that time. I was working on my book Pompeii. I had just started Pompeii, and so I just started Pompeii and was just feeling good. And I was drawing in this kind of like looser, freer style than maybe what I was doing previously with my comic Cold Heat. And I just kind of did another page, and then I did another page, and I never really did much more than that. I thought, well, maybe I'll do something with this. And then after Pompeii came out in English, it was translated in French, and in between in that 6-month period, Picture Box closed shop, and I went to France to promote the French version of my book Pompeii, and my French publisher one night at dinner said, well, I like that stuff that you're posting, about your family. Why don't you just keep doing a book about your family? And I said, okay,
sure.
Like that's a good idea. You really? What do you think? And he's like, yeah, like just you really seem to like drawing Pittsburgh, and like it's like more like Storyville, and like Pompeii was interesting, but Pompeii was more like a stage play, because like you can go to Pompeii and see what it looks like, but there's no roofs. It's just a ruin. So like to try to draw the real Pompeii is next to impossible. And so I just made it more like a stage play, that you don't really go pierce, the landscape. The landscape is more like a curtain in the background. And it's more like I set it up like a stage play on purpose. And I did feel like I wanted to draw more things, but like I didn't know those things. And so I just made it more like the graffiti that was on the walls in Pompeii, and that was part of the process of making it. And so the drawing of family, the drawing of Pittsburgh, the drawing of houses on the hill. I really enjoyed doing that, and my French publisher just encouraged me, and I just kind of like started building some scenes together, and it was a long process, but yeah, like it just, I didn't, it was, and I kind of like this better, and it didn't have like, it wasn't some conceptual idea that I was like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to make my opus or something like that. It kind of just grew organically and felt very natural, and it's more like a poem or something,
But are you going to go full 1990s Toronto cartoonist now? I kid.
Like, I can only hope, I like that genre. It's just an interesting. It's like shoegazer rock or something.
Yeah.
It's like
it was just an incredible run though.
Sure.
Seth, Chester,
sure,
Joe, and
sure.
We were.
Yeah,
hanging on every...
and then kind of just like walking around talking. It's a great... it works so well for comics. It's just like Seth's rubber stamp comics. Have you seen those?
Oh, yeah.
Those are incredible. Yeah. I show those to people and I just say like, look, you can just do this and like, you can talk about so many things in this fashion. But I do like that work. Somebody said, I think it was the guy that does the Bubbles zine. He reviewed the book and he said, I like this book because I didn't think that I was reading an autobiographical comic.
No, and just like I said, you're there, but you're not in front.
Yeah. Thanks.
And you're not. You talk about how you yearn for your parents, reconciliation somehow, but it's not.
It's never gonna happen.
Yeah, and it's the acceptance of that's that makes it a, I think a more human story. Now, I'm wondering about you talked about the lettering and being the only black elements, and the writing is spare. The textual writing is true. We know the comics themselves are writing. Was that driven by that decision in terms of letting the art stand and not cluttering too much with words, or is it tied into the fact that it was coming out in French first and translating it also means
for sure. Yeah.
Because interviewing Matoti was my experience of how do I do this without all the gill. Let me strip this down so he knows what I'm saying. And
I mean, knowing that it was going to be in French first and that then I would have to translate it, I did think about that. I also, for example, with Pompeii, because it's one color, I mean, I drew it in pencil, but then I printed that gray pencil in, a kind of an earth tone. And we used a paper that was kind of a, off-white paper. And so when you have, again, with the word balloons, it's the same color as everything around it. But when one does color comics and you have lots of words or big blocks of text, and if you make a box around it that's white, it just interrupts the color harmony of the page. And so the tracing paper thing and the translucency and just letting the color come through and then having the black ink words over top of it. But also the spareness of it all was more like wanting to be,
again, more of a poem.
Yeah. Thank you. Cause I was going to say like, it sounds, I don't, talking about poetry and stuff sometimes is hard because
I know you don't want to feel pretentious.
You don't want to feel pretentious, but also like I don't know anything about poetry in the same way that I don't know anything about music. Really, it's more of an intuitive. Like I read this great book called Creative Intuition by Jacques Maritain, and it's about like just this desire to like when the creative intuition, and you want to be a poet in all forms and all mediums. So if you're a painter, it's like that flash of inspiration and why you put the red down, or if it's a musician, why you play that note. If you're a writer,
dude, trust me, I'm spending my time trying to figure out how I'm going to get a shot where I capture the light on the one side of your face and not the other when we finish this thing.
That's
so
great.
Yeah, no, I'm
super. So your mind's always firing with these things, right? And how you capture that and how you do that, and so the words would come while I was drawing. And so I'd be drawing something and I would hear, my mom was in high school, my dad was in Vietnam, there's a photo of her in a white convertible in a white dress. And I just, I can like hear it. And it's like, to me, it's like, the breadth of poetry has a measure, like, sort of like, like epic poetry just has that cadence. Mm-hmm. And then even like Bob Dylan has that like cadence. And so you can, what the breadth is the measure. And so with comics, what the measure really is the left and the right of the page. And so if there's so much visual information and so much text information, and then if I have these giant text blocks that are really like a small or short poem, but they look giant on the page because compared to everything else on the page, or if you have so much dialogue that it becomes dense, like when it becomes dense, like there's so many, I love comics that are dense, but Ben Catcher once told me, I said, why don't you make this was in the 90s, and I said, why don't you just make a 100-page graphic novel? And I won't imitate his voice, but
I always do.
Wow, and he said you would like it, but it would be like an 8-hour movie if I did that. My strip is so dense that the density of that strip going on for 100 pages is way too much. And
that's
so
the Jew of New York. You have to put it down repeatedly. You cannot devote that much.
Right, and that came. So comics that are put out serially that then are collected. Who was it? Olivier Schwarren. I can't say his name, but he, when he did Arshni Schwarren, it says in between the chapters, like, put this book down for a week and then read the next chapter. And so, like, with serial comics, like, I get that, and I think so. Igort in Italy told me, like, the graphic novel is like this wonderful invention because I always had to work serially. So the idea that you could put out a 200 or 300 page graphic novel all at once is a new thing. And so that struck me. And I really thought about how when you do a 200 page comic at once, like, you kind of have to stay wide. Yeah. You can't put all that detail in, or it's going to be a 10-year project, And so, like, I would make the left and the right pages together in one day. Like, in one day I would make the images and I would have the words in mind and I would edit that stuff later. But like, when I was really working hard on this book, I worked, I think it was like 160 some days straight without a break. Like, I would get up every morning at 6 a.m. I would work until, 3 p.m. I would, just have and then I just stayed so immersed in the narrative, and then I just tried to like stay wide but have these details, and the details can just be in this like turn of a phrase, and you can do so much with. And that's another Ben Catcher thing, is like, you don't have the words reiterate what the image is showing. And that's the wonder, the contrapuntal harmony and rhythm of comics. And so having the words on an overlay and not considering how big the balloons are or something, that meant that I could edit all the way until the last minute, And so the disparity of the words, of the text, I just wanted to rhyme with the images, and the images are, somewhat spare. And I'm really into modal music. I mean, Miles Davis after his bebop period and, goes into modal music. It's just some of the greatest music ever made. And it's very spare, and it's more like, it's not like Japanese haikus or anything like that. There's like a lot of the 50s beatnik poetry or jazz gets compared to like, Japanese like brush paintings and stuff like that, and the improvisation of stuff like that. And I kind of get that, but you still see that stuff in like Matisse and other stuff earlier in the century, and way back in the past too. Like, Etruscan art is very spare. If you've ever seen Etruscan, tomb paintings reproduced, which actually did have a huge effect on me. And that was like part of like how I did Pompeii, and just so I'm better at doing like spare stuff and like the stuff that has a lot of detail in it. Like yesterday, somebody at the festival here in Columbus said, do do you draw like this because you can't draw like detail oriented? And
yeah, it reminds me of a story where go on.
No, go ahead. Tell me.
I can't remember who it was. I think it was Kaz. He was taking a class at SVA. Spiegelman brought in Mark Beyer, and Kaz apparently said, "So
do you draw like that on purpose?"
Yeah, basically.
And Beyer like walked
That's
out.
That's as good as I can draw, and just left the room.
Well, it's just so funny because like you wouldn't like in the last 100 years of art, there's so many examples of like. Oscar Kokoschka or somebody that just paints quickly and it's really spare. And there's so many art galleries that you go into today and you wouldn't walk in and say, was that as good as you can draw? Can't you like do some, really nice
flourishing.
Can't you do some nice 19th century style, So it's an interesting thing, and it's like comics people are kind of dumb, honestly, like
they're just
they're only interested in their stuff, and then they don't really know art outside of it, and it's just like, there's a great jazz musician named Don Byron who tried to have he put out a record that was like he did his own material, and then he did Stravinsky, and then he did a concert where it was like bebop and Stravinsky. And there was like these classical music guys and jazz guys in the lobby of the theater, like arguing about it.
The Sharks and Jets, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Because it was like, I wish it was more classical. I wish it was more jazz. And so, like we live in a postmodern, pluralistic. You can just pick and choose whatever you want to do in art. And so I want to make the comment. Ben Catcher told me, Ben's huge influence on me, and just like he's always coached me in these really kind of Yoda-like ways, and he just said, "Well, you just have to make the comic that you want to read."
That's my line about the show.
Yeah, there it is.
Talking to it was Huizenga, talking to him, and he was just interested in the equipment itself, and I said to him, Kevin, I don't want a podcast that sounds like two guys underwater,
right?
Because I recorded it on my phone. I put out a little money to have some decent mics and everything, so that
Kevin and I did a panel yesterday with Kurt Ankeny, and Kurt was able to figure out this correlation between my book and Kevin's book that like they're about time and the compression of time, and the expansion of time, and like Kevin and I are so different, and and I was tabling with him yesterday at this festival, and people come by and look at Kevin's book, and they're like, "Wow, this is very impressive," because it's so detailed, oriented, and I am impressed by it too, and I am jealous that he can do what he can do. Those same fans they look at my stuff and they just flip through it.
Markers,
they fold the book over and just go like, and they walk by and that's totally cool, but and that's not a judgment on the people going to the festival or comics fans or anything like that, but that's just we can, Kevin and I are very good friends, and I respect him a great deal because he can go from these minute details to this wide world of viewpoint. And so I just think that that's the wonder of early 21st century comics. It's like we can do anything, and so it's such a vital form right now that's, there's so many people doing great work, like Dominique Goblet or Julie Delport, big influences on me in the last couple of years. Connor Williamson, Joe Kessler, there's just these people that are making comics that don't look like comics, and that's something I notice is when I talk at art colleges, they'll say something about Raymond Pettibone, and they'll say, well, his comics, and I have to interject well, he doesn't do comics.
Yeah.
Well, but it looks like comics because it has the black line and the words. I'm like, well, right, but he's not doing sequential narrative. But it looks like comics. Yeah. So there's this perception of what looks like comics. And so I think I'm just making stuff that doesn't look like comics, but in 20 years we won't be having this conversation at all because there's been more and more full color comics. The expansion of printing technology and scanning technology. Like my French publisher said that this book wouldn't have been possible 10 years ago just because of the binding, the paper, the this, the that, the affordability of it all.
Yeah. So it would have been an art project that's
right.
$150
exactly.
a copy.
Yeah.
Well, I just think the first person I recorded with this weekend is Kate LaCour. And you look at Vivisectionary, and we could say that's comics, but you show somebody on the outside, regardless of the content, just the tableau nature of it, we can see the movement and see what's going on. But to a novice, they're not going to say that's comics, that's illustrations.
Right. Yes, exactly. Illustration with some text on it and stuff like that. And they're not seeing the sequencing. And then I think that comics can
encompass a whole lot. Yeah.
Exactly.
Now, do you prefer, has your work come out serially in other forms? Because I wonder, most of the guys I record with, it's that's the form we're used to.
I think it's madness. They all came up in the 90s. And so and I did too, but
But you weren't publishing
serially. I always thought that was
it's an economic model.
Yeah.
When it worked.
Well, even when I did Storyville in 95, I was like, can't there just be a one long book that is, I knew that you could do it, but it was always like collecting a thing.
Yeah.
And so I had friends that were not part of comics that were encouraging me, and Bill Boychel. I mean, Bill Boychel from Copacetic Comics was like, well, what you could do is you could just make, we were looking at these French albums, and you could make, a 100-page thing. It was going to be really expensive, and that's why I did it as a newspaper.
Yeah.
But, I just never wanted to do that thing where you put out an issue a year, and then, David Boring story in 8 Ball, I think they came out one a year for 3 years, and then it got collected. And so, Sammy Harcum, Kevin Huizenga, Jordan Crane, and people who came up in that era, that's the model that they follow, just because I think that's just the model that they feel comfortable with. And I think that's, great for them. But for me, that wasn't my interests or my style. I can't stay on model from one page to the next. I'm just not, when I draw people from life, when you draw a person from life or you draw things from life and you don't do reduction cartooning, it's hard to stay on model. And I'm just not interested in that. And so to do if I had to draw, a comic serially where I had to stay on model and draw in the same style for all these years, that's tough, because the artist that you were when you were when you started the project and the artist that you were when you ended the project is such a different thing. And so
that's my thing, man. This whole show is about becoming,
right,
and how you transform. And again, with something like Pittsburgh, where it's, like you said, remixed in a sense, where you're working on pages, but then these would actually work better here and there.
Sure.
If you had been putting it out serially, you're trapped in whatever that sequence was.
Yeah, and that's exactly. That's a very good. I never thought of it like that. That's really interesting. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, because I was editing down to the last minute, with that book and this book, and I had great editors. I had Bill Wiesel and Dash Shaw. Dash Shaw is one of the greatest comics minds.
I saw the two of you speaking at McNally Jackson. I don't mean just hanging out in the alley, but doing
I remember
a presentation.
That. Yeah.
It was really the first time I'd thought about page design, panel flow, etc. And it got me wondering where the theoretical aspect of comics began for you. That sense of breaking it down and understanding.
I did it intuitively. In the 90s, it was I did a 15-panel grid for Storyville, and it was because I was seeing these newspaper strip collections, and I just thought when they stacked Captain Easy strips on a page, I was that looked great, you know. And but when most grids don't have a center panel, and I was always fascinated with the center panel or the center tier, because then you had a pivot point. And so I did this 15-panel grid, and I kind of just did it intuitively. And then I kind of retired from comics for a few years, and I worked for an abstract painter named Dorothea Rockburn, and she's really interested in geometry and quantum physics and all of these things. And I was her assistant for a little bit, and then she came to my studio, and she just tore me to pieces and just said that I didn't know anything about geometry. My angles were all wrong. You know, you're just doing bad illustration as painting. You don't have any idea of how to just like put color on the, you know, like color harmony and then just geometrical modulation and sacred geometry and all these things. And she just she gave me a couple books to read, and I went down the rabbit hole. And there's this whole I mean, there's so many of the mid 20th century painters that employed these very rigorous rules of geometry to make their art. And so a lot of that gets reduced into kind of academic type things, like, you know, Donald Judd or something, you know, becomes like all minimalist and, you know, but like in painting, it's different because you're still dealing with the flat surface. And Dorothea's genius, and she's a math genius, and she made me, it was the first time in my life I understood math, and like I got math as geometry and how that's music. And when I understood that was music, then I understood music in this whole way, and then I heard music in this whole other way, and then I started thinking about like time signatures in my art and how you could have a time signature on a page in a spread, use the actual printing signatures, because even the printing signatures are on 8ths or on 16ths, and how that can be a measure for, you know, the length of the particular sequence or something like that. And so that was around 2002 or 3, and then I wasn't making comics then, I was just painting. And it's not like my paintings were like geometrical abstraction stuff, it just informed the size of the painting, like just even the scale of the painting, like every, you know, a lot of Picasso paintings are 1 meter by 1.4 meters, and that's like a very particular proportion, and it just, you know, so much of it's not, these things aren't arbitrary. I think a lot of times like we go into a museum and you just see like, it's a nice painting or something like that, but you know, those things aren't like arbitrary. And I, as a student of painting, didn't know a lot of those things, and it took like the oral tradition of learning painting and art from other people, and then seeing Ware's work, you know, you understand that he understands geometry and pages, and then people talk about his design and stuff like that. And so designers understand a lot of this, sort of like the way you break up a newspaper page or the way you break up a magazine page. And you know, because I think, you know, the layperson's always like, why is there so much white space in this in this paint? This doesn't make any sense. But it does make sense if you're a designer. But then how to inject that into comics, which generally are pretty dense and generally pretty loose and generally pretty much, I always call them like pudding school, like they just kind of like melt off the page. And, you know, Ware's rigorous formalism turns a lot of people off. But then I think there's just other ways of doing it. And then, you know, like I always talk about the Watchmen grid. I think, you know, Watchmen is like one of, you know, this, you know, remarkable books because it has that center panel. And I got to meet Eddie Campbell a few weeks ago, and I talked to him about his use of the 9-panel grid, and all of his comics, you know, for the last 40 years, I think had such an impact on the way people made comics. And then I could go on and on about grids, and people think I'm like grid crazy. But then I also think that the spread of the book itself is like, you know, that's a grid. You know, that's just a left, right.
Extension. Yeah,
it's a left, right heartbeat. And then to me, it's like free jazz. Like, you know, with free jazz, like people just think it's just blowing and crazy stuff. But really, there's a time signature underneath it. They hear it, you don't. But, you know, it's still going along, tick-tock, tick-tock. And so I just wanted to show that the book itself, the boundaries of the book itself, you can do so much inside of it. And I know playing in those time signatures, so to speak, I know where the sweet spots are. And so I'm just like playing with feeling within the restriction, like Baroque music or something like that. You know, it's very simple, but it's like a kind of like organic, it's an organic formalism that's less rigorous than hard edge painting or you know crazy design in books or something like that.
So I'm glad it wasn't I read Scott McCloud in 1993 and decided I had to start making comics, along those lines. Good.
Yeah, for sure.
So when we talk about becoming, how did you change over the course of Pittsburgh? Do you recognize?
I lost this, it had a real, a deep sadness, about my parents and,
sort of accepting the finality.
Yeah. And and I made it just in time. My dad's starting to lose his memory and stuff like that. And my mom, they're 70 now, 70 plus. And so, the last 10 years of preparing to make this and then getting it done before they leave this plane, I miss my parents, and I wanted to have them back together, and I changed by just sort of pulling out this thing that was wedged in it felt like it was always in my nasal passage or something, just I'm always ready to cry about it or something, and it's just I could just pull all that out and put it on the page and then have it come out. And it's not about them enjoying it or my family liking it or something. It was just it was, there's all these words cathartic or meditative or this or that. And I didn't do it for those reasons. I didn't think I would do it. It's kind of like a fluke, it just sort of happened. And I feel better about it. And I'm just thrilled when people like it, or not even like it, but just say it gave me, it was moving, or it gave me a feeling a lot of most of my books have this emotional through line or something. I respond to art that's emotionally engaging, and so I learned how to accept my. It's not it's just I don't want to talk about my emotions or my feelings. No, I just I want to. What I learned is just. I don't know, I learned how to grow as a person, or I learned how to make art that's not a careerist move or something, or make things that's not some calculated, attempt at
this will be my big breakthrough,
getting a screenplay or getting a deal or or something think of the greatest poetry ever, the best songs, they were probably written in 5 minutes, and and then somehow that they stay. And so I made this thing, and if it has legs, a legacy or something, and I'm not big on that, but I mean, it's definitely going to outlast me, and so ethnography, telling the story of your local neighborhood. There's a filmmaker in Pittsburgh named Tony Buba, Buba, and he was the sound guy on George Romero's movies. If you've ever seen the movie Martin, that's his parents' house in Braddock, Pennsylvania. And he made movies about, he'd make a 10-minute movie of his mother's sister washing the walls in the bathroom, in the kitchen in their house, and talking about emigrating from Italy, and that's it. That's the movie, Mm-hmm. But now that seems, that's a video clip or something. But to make that in 16 millimeter with sound in 1978 or whenever he made it, he was documenting this thing that was going on in his neighborhood, in his life, his family. And I think about it Sherwood Anderson or Faulkner or something, where you your little postage stamp of land is the most valuable thing. So my family, my little neighborhood that I grew up in, my memories of that stuff, that has value to me. And so I learned how to. I knew to cherish that, but I learned how to share it with other people and let them into that world. And a lot of my close friends said wow, there's stuff in that book that I've known you for 30 years and I didn't know some of those stories, and you never talk about that stuff. And it's not it's hidden or something, but just
It's not the sort of thing that just comes up in conversation.
Yeah. And I think that's part of it too, is like, we live in this world that it's easier to discuss hidden emotions and stuff like that. But when I went to France, my French publisher said, "You Americans, you just love to talk about your emotions all the time." Because
between puffs of cigarette.
Yeah. But it was kind of true, because it's like, okay, you feel sad about this or you're angry about this. Now what are you going to do? Like that's more what he was getting to. It's like, okay, yeah, we can have a therapy session for as long as you want, but then what are you going to do? And so I think making art is a great salve for that. It lets you do that and have put it out into the world in this other way, like music.
How was it received in France?
Very well. Yeah. I did a tour. It was the first time I ever had like a 4-city tour, and first time in my life I had lines waiting for people to get the book signed. Nice. And if you don't know, if the people listening don't know, like in France they expect you to make it's called a dédicace, and it's like you make a drawing for 5 or 10 minutes in the book while people are watching. It's kind of nerve-wracking. But and I did all that, and then I went to Angoulême, and then I went to Paris, and then I went to Lille and Metz and Besançon, and this little tour, and there were bookshop owners and managers who said, I've heard of your work, or I've seen Storyville or Pompeii, but this was the book that, I wanted you to be in the shop, and I've really pushed this. And, there was this one shop in Besançon, and I think the owner's name is Terry, and he had a sign in the window that said in French that it was like a Bruce Springsteen song, this is like the perfect American, and it was. I get chills thinking about it. I mean, like it's just to be. I don't know. I just. It was the. I've had books come out in France before that people. It's just like people like it, but it's like you do okay, sell do a couple signings, no big deal, and then this one kind of hit in a way that wasn't a runaway box office smash or anything like Durf, like the king of France.
It's not that it's inexplicable, but it is kind of amazing.
Durf, well, because Durf, I was there the year he won. We're talking about Back Durf, and My Friend Dahmer, and he won the Angoulême Prize that year, or one of the Angoulême Prize that year for his book, and just seeing that transformation, I just respect him so much. And I mean he's gone to France like 21 times. The book is in its 18th printing or something.
I think he mentioned yesterday that he's going back again sometime soon, that they're bringing him back.
I mean, like, it's just like, and so it's just a different world over there. It's really the Hollywood of comics. I mean, there's just the tradition in France and Belgium for comics is just so storied that to make a dent over there just gives me a good feeling. So yeah.
Horrible. Last question. Next project.
Just trying to kind of draw stuff that I'm interested in drawing. So I mean, actually, I got a research grant from the Billy Ireland Museum, Cartoon Library and Museum, to research Noel Sickles, Milton Caniff, Billy Ireland, Edwina Dumm. And I have this idea about there's an Ohio school of cartooning that was a big influence on all of cartooning, and I found some smoking guns to, I think, prove my point. So I'm doing a kind of an academic book about that, and you
and Eddie Campbell can fight it out.
That's right. Well, and then that was like me and Eddie. I said that I was going to steal his template, because the template for his Go-Getters book is such a great
isn't it
format.
Just wonderful to...
Well, the way it goes in and out of like he shares the material, and his commentary, or what he thinks about it, is just integrated in a way where it just flows. That it was one of the best like historical books about comics, and so yeah. So I want to kind of do a book like that, and then I just sort of want to do. There's so much cutting room floor material from this book that I don't necessarily think it'll be a family memoir again, but just sort of like I realized that I just want to draw Pittsburgh and houses on the hill and rivers and bridges and things like that, and lay over some prose poetry and just start there. So that's kind of I have some pages stacked up, but they don't really just sort of like little poems and stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I guess I should ask you the bonus last question. Do you see yourself ever moving away from Pittsburgh again?
Sure. Yeah, okay. Yeah. I've had expat fever for like the last year or so, like just wanting to be in Paris or wanting to be in Italy, Napoli especially. I love Napoli.
But visit or live?
It's one of those things where I go on vacation and then I get that like, I'm going to move there, and it's just like, probably a bad idea because they think it's cool that I live in Pittsburgh. But, living in a poor neighborhood in Pittsburgh is not always fun. So, yeah, I would. I did it a couple years ago. I moved to New Mexico and then came home with my tail between my legs because I wasn't, rugged enough to make it in the mountains of New Mexico. But, yeah, I would. It's not so ingrained in my identity. I would like to have a little bit of an expat life if I could, but you can only do like 6 months. Like 6 months here, 6 months there would be the ideal thing or something. But we'll see. I can always dream.
I'll let you get back to it. Frank, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks so much, Gil.
And that was Frank Santoro. His amazing new book is Pittsburgh, from New York Review Comics. It is, as I said, one of the best books I've read this year, and that's prose or comics, so please go give it a read. Now, Frank has a Tumblr that he doesn't seem to have updated for a few years at franksantoro.tumblr.com, but it does have some links to his other work, and you can go to the About Me part there and see a little more of his stuff. But you should also check out his Instagram at santoro.frank to see his art, appearances, and just the photos he posts there. And that's SANTORO.FRANK. He doesn't seem to do much social media otherwise, which, as we know, is for the best. And after we wrapped, I asked Frank, so, who you been reading? And if you want to hear his answer to that and get some extra conversation, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. Now that my conference is behind me, I will try to get the third quarter 2019 episode up next weekend. And meanwhile, you should go check out the second quarter episode because it's got a full hour of book recommendations and fun conversation with Mark Allen Stamety, David Shields, Michael Carroll, Frederick Tutton, Ursi Soteropoulos, Caitlin Foisey, Seth, Nina Bunjevac, Stephen Guarnacha, Hugh Ryan, Bill Griffith, Boris Fishman, and Barbara Nessim. You can support the Virtual Memories Show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, my secret project, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, I recorded this one during Cartoon Crossroads Columbus Weekend, or CXC, in September. Hotel was $560 for 2 nights. Airfare was $550. Parking at Newark was $100 or so. I also spent a little money on coffee and a couple of meals and a lift out to Ray Ray's Hog Pit and back. So figure like $1,300 for the weekend. That said, I got in 5 podcasts from Friday afternoon to Sunday, as well as some fun off-mic conversation, so it works out to a decent rate. Still, if you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories Show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, coffee, pulled pork, whatever, or just toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. Now, special thanks go out to Nick Bartosik, Buzz Carter, Michael Hacker, Michael Janizik, Fred Kish, Annie Koyama, Jonathan Kranz, Kevin Katila, Jack Lescamella, Stephen Nadler, Barbara Nessim, Jim Ottaviani, George Fow, Payne Prophet, Dmitry Samarov, David Small, Stephen Solomon, Greg Tanner, Ford Thomas, Armando Veve, and Garrett Zecker for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.